Hi everyone, I'm Pt.2. I'm a teaching artist at New Sullivan Elementary School and at Diet High School, and I'm also the artistic director of Fainty African Theater Ensemble. This video is part of an online learning initiative by Chicago Arts Partnerships in Education. So in our last video, it was an introduction to stage adaptation, and I introduced the novel that we were going to be working on, Mildred D. Taylor's The Gold Cadillac. So in this video, I am going to read the entire story in one sitting as I promised you, but we're going to divide the video into two parts for your easy viewing so that it won't be too long time in front of a screen. So you can pause the video right now, go get yourself a snack, something to drink, and then come back and sit comfortably somewhere and watch and listen, okay? Okay guys, so I'm gonna read, but just a disclaimer, you might see me dabbing my eyes a little bit. I have a bit of dry eyes and that causes your eyes to water. Strange, right? So I'm not crying, just watery eyes. All right, so we're gonna read now. This is the book again, The Gold Cadillac. All right, enjoy. My sister and I were playing out on the front lawn when the gold Cadillac rolled up and my father stepped from behind the wheel. We ran to him, our eyes filled with wonder. "Daddy, whose Cadillac?" I asked. And Wilma demanded, "Where's our Mercury?" My father grinned. "Go get your mother and I'll tell you all about it." "Is it ours?" I cried. "Daddy, is it ours?" "Get your mother," he laughed, "and tell her to hurry." Wilma and I ran off to obey as Mr. Pondexter next door came from his house to see what this new Cadillac was all about. We threw open the front door, ran through the downstairs front parlor and straight through the house to the kitchen where my mother was cooking and one of my aunts was helping her. "Come on, Mother dear," we cried together. "Daddy said, come on out and see this new car." "What?" said my mother, her face showing her surprise. "What are you talking about?" "A Cadillac," I cried. "He said, hurry up," relayed Wilma. And then we took off again, up the back stairs to the second floor of the duplex. Running down the hall, we banged on all the apartment doors. My uncles and their wives stepped to the doors. It was good it was a Saturday morning. Everybody was home. "We got us a Cadillac! We got us a Cadillac!" Wilma and I proclaimed in unison. We had decided that the Cadillac had to be ours if our father was driving it and holding on to the keys. "Come on, see." We raced on through the upstairs sunroom, down the front steps, through the downstairs sunroom, and out to the Cadillac. Mr. Pondexter was still there. Mr. Leroy and Mr. Cortland from down the street were there too, and all were admiring the Cadillac as my father stood proudly by, pointing out the various features. "Brand new 1950 Coupe de Ville," I heard one of the men saying. "Just off the showroom floor," my father said. "I just couldn't resist it." My sister and I eased up to the car and peeked in. It was all gold inside. Gold leather seats, gold carpeting, gold dashboard. It was like no car we had owned before. It looked like a car for rich folks. "Daddy, are we rich?" I asked. My father laughed. "Daddy, it's ours, isn't it?" Wilma asked, who was older and more practical than I. She didn't intend to give her heart too quickly to something that wasn't hers. "You like it?" "Oh, Daddy, yes." He looked at me. "What about you, Lois?" "Yes, sir." My father laughed again. Then I expect I can't much disappoint my girls, can I? It's ours, all right. Wilma and I hugged our father with our joy. My uncles came from the house and my aunts, carrying their babies, came out too. Everybody surrounded the car and oohed and awed. Nobody could believe it. Then my mother came out. Everybody stood back grinning as she approached the car. There was no smile on her face. We all waited for her to speak. She stared at the car, then looked at my father, standing there as proud as he could be. Finally, she said, "You didn't buy this car, did you, Wilbert?" "Gotta admit I did. Couldn't resist it." But what about our Mercury? It was perfectly good." "Don't you like the Cadillac, D?" "That Mercury wasn't even a year old." My father nodded. "And I'm sure whoever buys it is going to get themselves a good car. But we've got ourselves a better one. Now stop frowning, honey, and let's take ourselves a ride in our brand new Cadillac." My mother shook her head. "I've got food on the stove," she said, and turning away, walked back to the house. There was an awkward silence, and then my father said, "You know Dee never did much like surprises. Guess this here Cadillac was a bit too much for her. I best go smooth things out with her." Everybody watched as he went after my mother, but when he came back, he was alone. "Well, what'd she say?" asked one of my uncles. My father shrugged and smiled. "Told me I bought this Cadillac alone. I could just ride in it alone." Another uncle laughed. "Uh-oh, guess she told you." "Oh, she'll come around," said one of my aunts. "Any woman would be proud to ride in this car." "That's what I'm banking on," said my father as he went around to the street side of the car and opened the door. "All right, who's for a ride?" "We are," Wilma and I cried. All three of my uncles and one of my aunts still holding her baby, and Mr. Pondexter climbed in with us, and we took off for the first ride in the Gold Cadillac. It was a glorious ride, and we drove all through the city of Toledo. We rode past the church and past the school. We rode through Ottawa Hills, where the rich folks lived, and on into Walbridge Park and past the zoo, then along the Maumee River. But none of us had had enough of the car, so my father put the car on the road and we drove all the way to Detroit. We had plenty of family there, and everybody was just as pleased as could be about the Cadillac. My father told our Detroit relatives that he was in the doghouse with my mother about buying the Cadillac. My uncles told them she wouldn't ride in the car. All the Detroit family thought that was funny, and everybody, including my father, laughed about it and said my mother would come around. It was early evening by the time we got back home, and I could see from my mother's face she had not come around. She was angry now, not only about the car, but that we had been gone so long. I didn't understand that, since my father had called her as soon as we had reached Detroit to let her know where we were. I had heard him myself. I didn't understand either why she did not like that fine Cadillac, and thought she was being terribly disagreeable with my father. That night, as she tucked Wilma and me in bed, I told her that too. "Is this your business?" she asked. "Well, I just think you ought to be nice to Daddy. I think you ought to ride in that car with him. It'll sure make him happy. I think you ought to go to sleep, she said, and turned out the light. Later, I heard her arguing with my father. We're supposed to be saving for a house, she said. We've already got a house, said my father. But you said you wanted a house in a better neighborhood. I thought that's what we both said. I haven't changed my mind. Well, you have a mighty funny way of saving for it then. Your brothers are saving for houses of their own, and you don't see them buying new cars every year. We'll still get the house, Dee. That's a promise. Not with the new Cadillacs we won't, said my mother. And then she said a very loud good night, and all was quiet. The next day was Sunday, and everybody figured that my mother would be sure to give in and ride in the Cadillac. After all, the family always went to church together on Sunday. But she didn't give in. What was worse, she wouldn't let Wilma and me ride in the Cadillac either. She took us each by the hand, walked past the Cadillac where my father stood waiting, and headed on toward the church 3 blocks away. I was really mad at her now. I had been looking forward to driving up to the church in that gold Cadillac and having everybody see. On most Sunday afternoons during the summertime, my mother, my father, Wilma, and I would go for a ride. Sometimes we just rode around the city and visited friends and family. Sometimes we made short trips over to Chicago or Peoria or Detroit to see relatives there, or to Cleveland where we had relatives too. But we could also see the Cleveland Indians play. Sometimes we joined our aunts and uncles and drove in a caravan out to the park or to the beach. At the park or the beach, Wilma and I would run and play. My mother and my aunts would spread a picnic, and my father and my uncles would shine their cars. But on this Sunday afternoon, my mother refused to ride anywhere. She told Wilma and me that we could go. So we left her alone in the big empty house, and the family cars led by the gold Cadillac headed for the park. For a while I played and had a good time, but then I stopped playing and went to sit with my father. Despite his laughter, he seemed sad to me. I think he was missing my mother as much as I was. That evening, my father took my mother to dinner down at the corner cafe. They walked. Wilma and I stayed at the house chasing fireflies in the backyard. My aunts and uncles sat in the yard and on the porch, talking and laughing about the day and watching us. It was a soft summer's evening, the kind that came every day and was expected. The smell of charcoal and of barbecue drifting from up the block, the sound of laughter and music and talk drifting from yard to yard were all a part of it. Soon, one of my uncles joined Wilma and me in our chase of fireflies, and when my mother and father came home, we were at it still. My mother and father watched us for a while everybody else watched them to see if my father would take out the Cadillac, and if my mother would slide in beside him to take a ride. But it soon became evident that the dinner had not changed my mother's mind. She still refused to ride in the Cadillac. I just couldn't understand her objection to it. Though my mother didn't like the Cadillac, everybody else in the neighborhood certainly did. That meant quite a few folks too, since we lived on a very busy block. On one corner was a grocery store, a cleaner's, and a gas station. Across the street was a beauty shop and a fish market. And down the street was a bar, another grocery store, the Dixie Theater, the cafe, and a drugstore. There were always people strolling to or from one of these places, and because our house was right in the middle of the block, just about everybody had to pass our house and the Gold Cadillac. Sometimes people took in the Cadillac as they walked, their heads turning for a longer look as they passed. Then there were people who just outright stopped and took a good look before continuing on their way. I was proud to say that the car belonged to my family. I felt mighty important as people called to me as I ran down the street. "Hey, Lois, how's that Cadillac, girl? Riding fine?" I told my mother how much everybody liked the car. She was not impressed and made no comments. Since just about everybody on the block knew everybody else, most folks knew that my mother wouldn't ride in the Cadillac. Because of that, my father took a lot of good-natured kidding from the men. My mother got kidded too, as the women said if she didn't ride in that car, maybe some other woman would. And everybody laughed about it and began to bet on who would give in first, my mother or my father. But then my father said he was going to drive the car south into Mississippi to visit my grandparents, and everybody stopped laughing. My uncles stopped. So did my aunts. Everybody. "Look here, Wilbert," said one of my uncles. "It's too dangerous. It's like putting a loaded gun to your head." "I pay good money for that car," said my father. "That gives me a right to drive it where I please, even down to Mississippi." My uncles argued with him and tried to talk him out of driving the car south. So did my aunts, and so did the neighbors, Mr. Leroy, Mr. Cortland, and Mr. Pondexter. They said it was a dangerous thing, a mighty dangerous thing, for a black man to drive an expensive car into the rural South. Not much those folks hate more'n to see a northern Negro coming down there in a fine car, said Mr. Pondexter. They see those Ohio license plates, they'll figure you coming down uppity, trying to lord your fine car over them. I listened, but I didn't understand. I didn't understand why they didn't want my father to drive that car south. It was his. Listen to Pondexter, Wilbert, cried another uncle. We might have fought a war to free people overseas, but we're not free here. Man, those white folks down south will lynch you soon as look at you. You know that. Wilma and I looked at each other. Neither one of us knew what lynch meant, but the word sent a shiver through us. We held each other's hand. My father was silent. Then he said, all my life, I've had to be heedful of what white folks thought. Well, I'm tired of that. I worked hard for everything I got. Got it honest too. Now I got that Cadillac because I liked it and because it meant something to me that somebody like me from Mississippi could go and buy it. It's my car. I paid for it and I'm driving it south. My mother, who had said nothing through all this, now stood. Then the girls and I'll be going too, she said. No, said my father. My mother only looked at him and went off to the kitchen. My father shook his head. It seemed he didn't want us to go. My uncles looked at each other, then at my father. You set on doing this? We'll all go, they said. That way we can watch out for each other. My father took a moment and nodded. Then my aunts got up and went off to their kitchen too.